Take a network break. I'm Drew Conry Murray.
I'm Jonna Johnson, and today we'll be discussing some security vulnerabilities, an AI breach, some concerning developments at the U.S. federal government, and a bunch of financial results from companies beginning with the letter A. Good job there, Drew.
Yeah, I arranged it perfectly. Yeah, we do have a lot of news to get to. Just want to let you know that we also have a Tech Bytes conversation at the end of the podcast. We're going to talk about digital experience monitoring, internet performance monitoring with Catchpoint. As more users rely on SaaS and cloud for applications, the internet's essentially become a business critical network. But how can you, a network engineer, be expected to manage the internet? Enter internet performance monitoring, or IPM. We talk with Catchpoint about its approach to IPM, how it measures performance and reports it back to you. And we get some specific examples from Catchpoint about what they can do. And before we get into the news, just a reminder, we've got Packet Pushers merch. There's sweatshirts, t-shirts, mugs, hats, and more. It's all at store.packetpushers.net. So if you want to fly your nerd flag, check it out. John, let's dive into the red alerts.
Absolutely. So there were 826 CVEs published in the last week, of which 52 were criticals with a CVS of 9.5 or more, and 3 had a perfect 10. We're going to go highlight a few of these and also note some older vulnerabilities that still pose threats. Drew, why don't you kick it off?
Yeah, we're talking about Cisco first. They are warning of 2 critical vulnerabilities in the Identity Services Engine, or ISE software, that could allow an authenticated remote attacker to execute arbitrary commands and escalate privileges. Both of these CVEs have a critical rating, including one with a 9.9 out of 10. Cisco has released patches. They say there is no other workaround. So if you are running ISE, hit the show note links and get going.
And another red alert, OWASP Top 10 strikes again, this time at charities. CVEs 2025 24905, 906, and 957 document vulnerabilities in multiple modules of WeGIA, an institutional web manager used mainly by NGOs and charitable organizations. Each of the flaws allow attackers to see, manipulate, or delete any data stored in the package. We highlight these 3 not because WeGIA is so broadly deployed, it's open source, so it's kind of hard to know, but because the vulnerabilities are so basic, they're injection flaws. So this is still near the top of the top 10, was number 1 there for a decade, and still been on that list since its inception 20 years ago. Organizations using it are advised to upgrade to the latest version, and please pay attention to injection flaws in general. And there are links in the show notes.
Moving on, the router maker Zyxel says it's not patching some critical vulnerabilities on some models of its CPE routers. Instead, the company says the affected models are end of life and should be replaced. The vulnerabilities were discovered last year, and at least one is now being actively exploited, according to researchers. TechCrunch notes that some models that Zyxel says are EOL are still for sale on Amazon. These products are often deployed by ISPs at customer premises. So there's probably lots of people out there who don't even know they're running a Zyxel router. And even if they do, I don't think they should be made to buy a new router out of pocket if their ISP isn't going to replace it, if Zyxel isn't replacing it. So I think this is not a smart move by Zyxel.
Yeah, no, I agree. That definitely deserves some censure. Moving along, a CVE that came out last year has been ratcheted up in urgency. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, issued a warning urging U.S. federal agencies, and presumably anyone else, to secure their systems against ongoing attacks, that is, ongoing live exploits that target a critical Microsoft Outlook remote code execution, RCE, vulnerability. This is a last year vulnerability. It's the number is 2024-21413. You'll see the references in the show notes. It was discovered by Checkpoint and arises due to improper input validation when opening emails containing malicious links, which means that attackers can gain remote code execution capabilities by bypassing protected view, which is supposed to prevent exactly that, which means you can execute malicious Office files, potentially compromising systems. The company patched this vulnerability a year ago, but also said the preview pane could serve as an attack vector, meaning that even previewing a malicious document could lead to exploitation, and that is, in fact, what the warning is about. CISA says basically it is being actively exploited and requires that U.S. federal agencies must secure their networks by February 17th. February 27th within a 3-week deadline, and talks about the fact that these pose significant risks to enterprises. So for private organizations, you probably kind of want to do the same thing. Go ahead and read up on it, find out what the risks are, and patch this vulnerability ASAP.
Right, that wraps up the red alert section for the show. We'll get into the regular news, although we'll stay federal. Security experts and U.S. senators are warning of serious security and privacy risks from Elon Musk's DOGE team members getting access to sensitive government systems, including the U.S. Treasury and the Office of Personnel Management. U.S. Senators Elizabeth Warren and Ron Wyden sent a letter to the Government Accountability Office with a list of questions, including who authorized these people and whether these people had the appropriate training and clearances. I've also got links in the show notes to stories citing cybersecurity officials, including one that cites Jason Kitka. He's a former U.S. Cyber Command official who said in an interview with Recorded Future News, this has the potential to be the largest breach of government systems ever by orders of magnitude and could have consequences for decades. I will note this is a fast-moving story with a lot of moving parts. So by the time you hear this, there may have been updates, but this is what we know so far.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to add to it is one of the big concerns is that one of the people with access to the government treasury payment system has the ability to actually push out code into a production environment, which, as we all know, is a massive no-no. And just to give people an understanding of the scale of this problem, this is about $6 trillion in transactions that can be crashed if a mistake is made. So even if you don't assume any nefarious purposes on the part of DOGE, it's extremely concerning that a production system has the ability for a single programmer with no validation or verification to push out changes. What's also a little concerning is that initially it was claimed that he did not have the ability to make any changes to running code, but simply could look at it. And in fact, that was found to be false, which is disturbing because, why would somebody tell you something that's not the truth?
Yeah.
So this is both from a stability perspective and a security perspective, a real concern. And as you might imagine, quite a lot of people are up in arms about it. There are plenty of links in the show notes. You can probably go on LinkedIn and find out a lot more. I think cybersecurity people are starting to really wake up to the risk that this poses, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, and speaking of cybersecurity people waking up to risks posed by various things, Watchtower wants to remind everybody that software supply chain risks are, may exist from gone but not forgotten infrastructure, which I will highlight in a side note is why end-of-lifing critical systems is so incredibly important. You want to get rid of something once it is no longer serving its purpose because it can always serve as a backdoor. Researchers at Watchtower set out in November to demonstrate the viability of a large-scale supply chain attack on the internet leveraging abandoned infrastructure. And here's the kicker. We're not talking bridges or warehouses. We are talking about Amazon S3 storage buckets. Pursuant to this
good old
goal,
Amazon S3 storage buckets.
right. They ferreted out about 150 buckets that have been used by someone or other in software development and deployment, someone or other being commercial entities, governments, open source projects, and then abandoned. Abandoned, but not excised from code bases and config scripts, because it turned out that after Watchtower resurrected the buckets by re-registering them, requests for content supposedly stored on them began to pour in. Ultimately, more than 8 million requests over 2 months. Requested materials included code, unsigned binaries, virtual machine images, cloud formation templates, and more. These file requests came from networks in more than 8 countries, militaries, members of the Fortune 100 and Fortune 500, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, Watchtower emphasizes this is not an S3 problem. It is simply a software supply chain problem. And the fix is when you are no longer using something, wrap it up, destroy it, delete it, get rid of it. And in fact, more broadly, strategically, you should always have an end-of-life plan for any initiative that you launch, and you should very clearly have triggers that launch that end of life, because really what happens is not that people are stupid or lazy. It's more the case that you don't know when something is actually done with, so you kind of keep it there just in case. And you need to really put in place some triggers that say, no, we've decided this is over. In the highly unlikely event that we've deleted something prematurely, here's how we will recover it. But for now, we're taking it out of production.
Yeah, that's sort of the backside of the ease with which you can spin up infrastructure and resources and services in the public cloud. Even if you think you're done with them, they might still be there. So yeah, important stuff.
Absolutely.
Moving on, Ethernet switch sales for AI backend networks is forecast to reach 100 billion by 2029. That's according to research by Del Oro. The analyst firm says Ethernet is fast becoming more favored than InfiniBand as the network fabric for connecting GPU clusters. Current beneficiaries for Ethernet sales are Huawei, Celestica, and NVIDIA, but Dell'Oro is estimating that Arista, Cisco, Juniper, and Nokia will gain more traction in 2025 and beyond. The report also notes that 800 gig ports will be widely deployed in AI backend networks by the end of 2025, but will eventually be overtaken by 1.6 terabit and 3.2 terabit ports by 2030.
Yep. I think the conclusion here, Drew, is never bet against Ethernet. And I think we've said that a bunch of times previously. So no surprises here.
Yeah. And frankly, I mean, 800 gig is amazing, but 3.2 terabits for Ethernet, I don't know that. How many of us foresaw that? That is frankly stunning.
Yeah, I was looking at those numbers and thinking, well, you can predict it kind of using a Moore's law of networking, but yes, when it actually happens, it's still pretty surprising.
Yeah. And just to note that AI infrastructure spending is going to be a theme in this episode.
Absolutely. We're going to hear a lot more about that from companies beginning with the letter A. So, and the other big theme, of course, is, well, the other two big themes are AI and security breaches. And the next news item actually highlights both of them. WIS details massive DeepSeek info leak. Cybersecurity researchers at WIS discovered that DeepSeek, the Chinese AI startup, left two databases containing information publicly exposed. The data, stored on unsecured ClickHouse instances, reportedly included over 1 million log entries showing users' prompts and chat histories in plain text, as well as API keys used to authenticate API queries, backend implementation details, and DeepSeek operational metadata. It might be possible to extract passwords in the clear as well. DeepSeek closed accesses to the resources once it was notified, but we have no idea how long the exposure actually persisted. What a surprise. Tell me you're shocked.
Yeah, that's funny. No, I'm not shocked. I mean, it ties right into the story you were just talking about earlier. It's open databases on the web. It bites everybody, even the folks building DeepSeek. Although maybe it's just DeepSeek really taking open source to heart here with this model.
Well, I do want to highlight something, and it possibly should have been a news item, but there's just so much going on. Very recently, researchers who developed HarmBench, which is a framework for measuring the degree to which an AI model is susceptible to being weaponized, with a broad definition of weaponized, meaning used for nefarious purposes, not necessarily turned into an actual weapon of war. It turns out that DeepSeek scored 100%, which is it failed absolutely every test. And the folks at HarmBench have 510 separate tests that they kind of deploy in an automated fashion. And DeepSeek failed all of them. But all the other AI models pretty much failed as well, ranging from 65% to 85% failure rates. So I think it's worth noting that there are an awful lot of vulnerabilities that we haven't even begun to think about associated with these AI models, and we'll continue to hear that, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we'll move on. UK security officials are ordering Apple to allow full unencrypted access to all Apple users' data stored in the company's iCloud services. That is not just individual users who are part of a criminal investigation or just UK citizens, but any iCloud user anywhere in the world. That's according to reporting by the Washington Post. The order is targeting an Apple service called Advanced Data Protection, which allows Apple customers to encrypt iCloud data so that only the individual and not Apple can decrypt it. The Washington Post cites unnamed sources that say Apple is likely to withdraw the service in the UK rather than comply by putting a backdoor in for the UK government. Jonna, we've talked a lot about, sort of this tension between the need for encryption and law enforcement not liking encryption, but in some cases, law enforcement saying, all right, you have to use encryption, particularly after like the Salt Typhoon attacks.
Yeah, and I think, really the UK law enforcement is possibly putting itself on the wrong side of history here because, as you mentioned, Drew, this past December, the FBI, CISA, and NSA recommended that Americans begin using end-to-end encrypted apps, that were, of course, they threw in the flag, that are appropriate, or they had some sort of phrase that basically meant apps that we can possibly get into, please. But in any event, we'd rather nobody get into it, then give it all to the Chinese and not to us. And I do agree if Apple does take that move, that is the correct move, because basically why would anyone use Apple if it knew that all of its information is going to the UK government? Of course, everybody thinks governments in the West are perfectly fine and safe and pose no threat, but perhaps that's not entirely the case.
Yeah, I'm frankly, kind of gobsmacked about the breadth of this order being, I can see them saying, look, we're investigating a criminal here in the UK. We need your help. But anybody's data our data in the US, somebody's data in a country outside of the UK and Europe, China. It just that the broadness is stunning, and I hope that Apple does put up a fight. Um, the other thing is I'll note is I'm starting a countdown clock on whether the US government also will make a similar demand of Apple here in the US.
That's an interesting question. In fairness, it would not be the first time a government has made that claim. The Chinese government actually has a regulation called PIPL that essentially says the same thing, which makes it extremely dangerous to capture any data that might be construed by the Chinese government as pertaining to Chinese nationals. And I'm wording that very carefully because it doesn't actually have to be pertaining to Chinese nationals. It could just be pursued that way. Or construed that way. So yeah, you're right. This is a general move by governments everywhere, and it is concerning.
Yeah. All right, some financial news. First, we'll start with AMD. They reported Q4 and full year 2024 results. The company had a record quarter and a record year for revenues. For the quarter, AMD revenues were $7.7 billion, up 24% over this time last year. Net income was $482 million. For the year, AMD revenues were $26 billion, up 14% over 2023, with net income of $1.6 billion. Jonna, can you guess why AMD had such a good quarter and a good year?
I can't imagine. I mean, it could be something trendy like AI. No, that can't be.
Yeah, that was it. So in particular, AMD's data center segment, which includes its GPU sales, jumped 94% in 2024. GPU sales alone brought in about $5 billion in revenue for AMD. And just for some context, last week we talked about Intel's financial results. For 2024, Intel had revenues of $53 billion, so twice AMD's. But AMD is posting revenue growth and profits while Intel is losing money.
Exactly. I mean, that basically the big single difference here is AI and
Yeah.
investment in AI infrastructure.
So I looked at the earnings call transcript that the company has with investors, and AMD CEO Lisa Su said she's, quote, bullish on the GPU business and is anticipating growing it to tens of billions of dollars for AMD over the next couple of years out of a total addressable market of about $500 billion. She also, of course, as you might expect, got a question about DeepSeek and whether that would reduce the overall market opportunity, because when DeepSeek first came out, it was there was a lot of concern because it was built on, lower capability GPUs, lower end GPUs, and what did this mean for the whole market? She definitely turned the question on its head and essentially said that being able to do training and inference with less infrastructure will actually allow AI compute to expand more broadly and accelerate the pace of adoption and innovation. So I think her basic take is, more AI means more need for infrastructure. So that's going to be good for us regardless. I know that's just sort of the verbal judo that CEOs are supposed to use, but frankly, I think she's probably right.
Yeah, rising tide lifts all boats tends to work very, very effectively.
Yeah. Link in the show notes if you want to see the results for yourself. We'll move on. Amazon announced Q4 and full year results. We'll focus on its AWS business. For the quarter, AWS net sales were $28.8 billion, up 19% year over year. For the full year, AWS had net sales of $107.6 billion, also up 19%. However, shares fell after Amazon reported its results. According to Reuters, the culprits were, quote, weaknesses in the retailer's cloud computing unit and lower than expected forecasts for first quarter revenue and profit. So as Greg Farrow always used to say, it's not what you've done for me today, it's what are you going to do for me tomorrow?
Well, and I'll also weigh in on the fact that Amazon has historically had a love-hate relationship with the street, because for many, many years, Jeff Bezos used to plow every single penny back into R&D, and so it wasn't paying dividends, which of course now seems awfully quaint and cute. And the street hated that and said, you're not making a profit, so why should we rate you highly? And Jeff's
Right.
comment was, because I'm being strategic about the use of my resources. History shows who's right, so I'm not worried too much about, the little blip in their shares. It looks like they're profiting quite nicely from the current trends in cloud infrastructure and AI infrastructure generally.
Yeah, and I will say that spending is going to continue. All of the major cloud providers and others are spending billions and billions of dollars on AI and AI infrastructure. It is making Wall Street a little antsy, and we'll see if the bets pay off.
Yep. And as you pointed out, Drew, they're spending whether they like it or not, because this is a table stakes, you have to be at the table in order to get some winnings kind of a strategy.
That's right. And our last A company reporting financial results is Google, or Alphabet. They spelled out their Q4 and full year 2024 results. For consolidated Alphabet, the company had Q4 revenues of $96.5 billion, up 12% year over year. 84.1 billion of that comes from search revenues in YouTube. Google Cloud revenues were 12 billion for the quarter, up 30%. However, that number also missed Wall Street expectations, so they got dinged. That said, 30% growth is pretty good. That beat AWS's growth. That's a positive direction for Google, which has been sort of the number 3 cloud provider in North America. So they are starting to make up ground. I'll just note for the full year, Alphabet, which includes Google Search and YouTube, had revenues of $350 billion, up 14%, and a net income of $100 billion. So Search continues to just print money by the bucket load for Google.
Which actually makes me happy because I am not a fan of AI as a replacement for search, but that's neither here nor there.
Right. And just to tie back to the fact that all these companies are pouring lots and lots of money into AI infrastructure, Google CEO Sundar Pichai said the company is going to spend $75 billion in 2025 in CapEx, the majority of which is expected to go toward data centers and servers.
Yep. This is as you said, this is the era of AI infrastructure. Selling gold mining tools to the miners.
Exactly.
So finally, we're going to go ahead and wrap up with some space networking. AST Space Mobile has gotten a green light to test full services to end users. In the U.S., the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, has granted AST Space Mobile what is called Special Temporary Authority, STA, so that it can conduct tests of its satellite-based cellular service with AT&T and Verizon. The company can now fire up the first 5 of its low Earth orbit Bluebird satellites. Customers involved with the test will have access to their services via their existing unmodified smartphones, which is actually kind of cool. AST Space Mobile services will leverage premium low-band wireless spectrum from the carriers and support voice, text, video, and data services and anything else that's native cellular. Good stuff.
So do you said fire up, does this mean these satellites are already in orbit and just need to be activated, or they need to get these satellites
Correct.
into orbit?
The satellites are in orbit and get turned on, basically, get to get used for testing purposes.
Okay.
And as a person who spends a fair amount of time in places that don't have great cell phone service, I find this delightful and transformative because when you're out on the Atlantic Ocean and you kind of need to phone home, it's really wonderful to not have to be carrying a small VSAT with you or something else.
Yeah, just send a text.
Right, we're not there yet, but it is lovely to think about the fact that we're getting close. The only sad thing is, one of my colleagues pointed out not too long ago, that only a couple of years ago there were about 2,000 satellites in around the Earth, and now there are 20,000 in orbit, and many of them can be seen with the naked eye, which means that we've got an entire generation of people who will never know what the sky looks like with just stars in it.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of issues around things like space junk and old satellites being brought back to Earth and so on. That's interesting new problems we're going to be dealing with. But on the plus side, we can get text messaging from space.
There you go. So everything's a trade-off, as always with
Everything's a
technology.
trade-off. All right, that wraps up the news portion of the show. Stay tuned for our sponsored Tech Bytes conversation with CatchPoint, where we're going to be talking about their Internet Performance Monitoring Service, or IPM. That's coming right up. Today on the Tech Bytes podcast, we dive into digital experience monitoring and internet performance monitoring with sponsor CatchPoint. Now, as more users are relying on SaaS and cloud for applications, the internet has essentially become a business-critical network. But how can you, a network engineer, be expected to manage the internet? Enter Internet Performance Monitoring, or IPM. We're going to talk with CatchPoint about its approach to IPM, how it measures performance and then reports it back to you, and get specific examples of what CatchPoint can do. Our guest is Leo Vasilou, Director of Product Marketing at CatchPoint. And unless you worry that Leo's just here to market at you, he comes from the DevOps trenches and has the scars to prove it. So we're going to have a good technical conversation. Leo, welcome to the podcast. Can you just give us a 30-second overview of CatchPoint to get folks some context?
First, thank you very much for having me. And jumping right in, we talk about CatchPoint as the Internet Performance Monitoring Platform. As you already hinted at, growth in internet centricity is worsening our visibility into the internet stack, and that is the primary problem we solve for, that loss of visibility. And here at CatchPoint, we simply believe that the internet and the internet stack needs to be resilient, that is, be able to adapt to or withstand adverse conditions.
Now, you mentioned IPM, Internet Performance Monitoring. Is that okay? So I've been doing monitoring for years, and we called it NPM, Network Performance Monitoring. Is IPM distinct from that?
Yes, absolutely, right? So think about something like old school application monitoring. You install these agents, collect your metrics, logs, events, traces, and eventually we came to talk about that as observability so we don't have to say and list all those different capabilities. For networking, we would talk about flow, packet capture, Wireshark, SNMP, syslogs, and the like. And that evolved into a concatenated discipline, NPM, right? Network performance monitoring, network performance management, depending on how you think about it. And if we conversationally say the internet is your new network, and we talk about things like BGP monitoring, DNS monitoring, anything as a service monitoring, external network paths, peering, this is evolved into IPM to account for this new internet is your new network. Main difference being an internet-centric focus for reliability and resilience.
So internet
So
focused, as in, does that mean you're monitoring things? Well, you mentioned BGP. So if there's a change in the BGP uh, routing table that significantly impacts the connectivity between me and some SaaS service I'm trying to get to, Catchpoint would know that.
You are correct. So, a flap, a hijack, I mean, essentially the idea is that from wherever people access your sites, your apps, your services, we want to be able to help you keep an eye on that. So, if the fit does hit the shin, you can figure out why that happened.
Got it. Okay.
so you mentioned resilience earlier, and that sounds nice, but what do you actually mean about internet resilience? Can you put a little more meat on that?
You know why that is such a great question? Because I don't want that term resilience to become yet another term that sales and marketing bastardize, in the vein that
You might be too late, Leo, but go ahead.
in the vein that monitoring and meeting all of your internal service level objectives does not necessarily mean your users across the globe are having a good experience. We wanted to create these pillars to incrementally account for a state of resilience, again, the capacity to adapt or withstand adversity, but also include that outside in perspective. And so the four pillars are availability, performance, reliability, and arguably the most important, reachability. And it's that last one that catalyzes the fact these four pillars apply to way more than just your internal clouds, data centers, etc.
Well, we would dig into that. Okay, reachability, because to me that's the obvious one, right? Obviously, I've got to be able to reach the thing, and then what becomes interesting about the path between me and the thing I'm trying to reach would be availability, performance, reliability, maybe. But you're really saying reachability is the thing.
I guess I am when I hear you put it that way. It The way I think about it is in a single word, right? Remember we were talking about earlier encapsulating capabilities into as short a term as possible. In a single word, it is what makes us think about the internet as part of the picture, so people can work to avoid this gravity of inward in or inside out focus of all of the internal. Everything internal is green, but users are still complaining situation.
Yeah, because you can, reach a site, but that doesn't mean you're getting good performance out of all of the hops in between you and that site, right? That's what you're
Or
talking
vice
about.
versa, vice versa. What good is a brightly burning sun if its rays cannot reach you on the beach? What good is a high availability, high performing application data center if your services can't reach users wherever they are in the world? 100%.
So,
Okay.
so for example, Drew and I use Zoom all the time. We spend a lot of time in Zoom meetings, and every once in a while, one of the whoever of us that are online will be getting, oh, internet connection's unstable. And where's the problem? Who knows? Is it the Wi-Fi in the house? Is it a middle mile somewhere? Because not all of us are experiencing internet unstable. Occasionally, it is Zoom. Zoom's actually experiencing an outage that affected everybody on the call. But drilling into what's actually going on, so you can diagnose it, is a painful process if you've got no insights and you can't see anything.
Head nodding, head nodding. That is excellent playback.
Yeah, how is Catchpoint doing this when you say you monitor the internet? Because that's a pretty big claim.
I suppose I have to start with what is the corest, most foundational aspect and critical success factor for the way to think about implementations, IPM implementations. If I may ask to picture a globe with thousands of dots in hundreds of cities, in hundreds of countries, and hundreds of ISP combinations, what you are visualizing is what we refer to as our network of intelligent agents from where telemetry is collected. Now, what makes this agent network so unique is the different types, grades, classes of ISPs and points of interconnection that we have those agents distributed across. Yes, we have hundreds of cloud agents and cloud providers, but they don't do much more than ensure your app and your cloud infrastructure is available. That's why we have agents on the backbone, broadband ISPs, why we have agents on the last mile eyeball networks, why we have agents on wireless multi-access, 5G, et cetera, to see and have troubleshooting capabilities across the entire internet and internet stack to be able to answer questions like, hey, is this a problem with me or my stuff, or is the internet having a bad day? If so, where? If so, why? So it all starts with an extremely large, arguably the largest network of intelligent agents around the globe.
Okay, so we've got a big network of intelligent agents. I love the fact that you might be able to tell me if I'm on some tier 2 regional network, the way things are laid out here in North America. You could tell me it's like, yeah, it's your regional provider, buddy. We got an agent on that network, and it's them. They're having a bad day. And I assume more specifically, you could say they're having a bad day at one of their junction points that connects them to this specific tier 1 backbone. We are seeing significant packet loss on the interconnect between your provider and where they interconnect to some tier 1 backbone.
That's right. Tier 1 backbone, tier 2 that buys traffic, anything like that. And, now that we've kind of painted a picture visually of agents, I mean, I guess I'll just pick a semi-arbitrary capability, DNS, BGP. There are many protocols we could talk about, but DNS, for example, right? We think of more things being bought as a service. And I think about a year ago, I saw a data point that 79% of organizations use at least one third-party DNS provider, and 64% said even though those endpoints are from third-party providers, that they should still monitor them. And I would reference Google multi-party dilemma with Sarah Butt and Alex Elman, they tell a wonderful story about that dilemma better than I could. But let's say all these agents all over the world, different points of interconnection. What is the IP address of catchpoint.com? And that takes 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, something like that. Good black box monitor. Probably a lot of people do it. But what if that response time, that DNS resolution time goes up to a second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, whatever? Enter another thing where we kind of go above and beyond what people are typically used to. So DNS as a full resolver monitor. So level 1 is your TLD. Level 2 might be your name servers. Level 3 might be Akamai's traffic manager. Level 4 might be Akamai's regional POPs, and so on and so forth. So we'll turn that black box data into a white box data where you can break down by different levels, and more importantly, take specific action on those specific levels depending on what priority you place on it during your triage.
It's a stupid example, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If I get the spinny thing on Netflix and the video won't start, can you tell me what cache it was probably coming out of and why it was slow?
Well, if you've already got the spinny thing, that means you've probably already established a DNS connection. So then what I might do is I might start looking at some of the other metrics that we capture. In that case, if you can even get to the server, then you'd look at the load time, right? What we call the response time. Or if you can't, then let's just go back and talk about reachability some more.
Okay.
Other examples, can you do trace routing?
A trace route, yeah. So And I'm sorry I keep going back to the network of agents, but again, just kind of keep that in mind as we talk about trace routes. So probably people expect us to be able to do trace routes across, TCP, UDP, and the like. But one of the other things that we do that's kind of unique when we think about the evolution, higher demand for performance, right? My kid's screaming when he's playing Fortnite, L4S, right? Low latency, low loss scale. So what we do with our trace route, among some of the other things, is we allow you to set ECN flags, so you can see whether or not ECN is being bleached. And if I
ECN,
could just
explicit
reference
congestion notification.
explicit congestion notification, and we actually did a study of what regions were better or worse at ECN bleaching. And I would say just Google ECN bleaching catch point to see the data. But it's just absolutely fascinating. Just another example of where we kind of go above and beyond what's expected for, excuse me,
Bleaching, as in the ECN notification is dropped at some point, so
is
the
being
remote site doesn't
dropped.
know that there's an issue.
And I'll venture to say that you would be surprised where the U.S. placed on that naughty list.
So this is a deliberate attempt to try to hide the fact that there is some kind of issue along the path?
Because also, the ECN has to be supported across the entire path too, right? So we can't forget that, but that's exactly right. So think companies whose revenue comes from streaming, right? They want it to be as fast as possible. Well, the big boys, I don't want to put anybody on the spot. They're trying to get this L4S to be more recognized, more standard across the board. And so what we do with our trace route allows them to do that.
You also mentioned BGP monitoring. Can you dig into that a little bit more about what the services are you can provide?
BGP, right? So we take sources from RIPES, RIS, route views. So they publish that in 15-minute increments. And then we have our own catch point peers, which we built to try to get that BGP info in as near real time as possible. And then if you want to become part of our partner program, then you can apply, send us your info, and then you can do use cases, for example, for your internal BGP egress. What's that look like? So for prefixes originating from inside your network, it's useful to triage problems where calls might be coming from inside the house versus outside, just as an example. So hijacks, flaps, I think I mentioned convergence delays already, black holes, boo-boos in traffic shaping, traffic engineering, and the like, right? BGP monitoring, one of our core use cases.
So it's in hijacking then. If someone's doing that bogus announcement for some prefix that they don't actually own, you can detect that it did happen and who's responsible?
And I suppose we probably should also say that we do want to raise awareness of this, that BGP compared to maybe DNSSEC, another one of the protocols we support monitor for, is more vulnerable than people think, but you are correct, right? All of a sudden, what the frick happened to my traffic, or what should we do with our traffic? Because our page views dropped and our CMO is freaking out because conversions just dropped to 0 or something like that, just if we had to talk about it in a business context.
So Leo, Gartner recently released a Magic Quadrant for digital experience monitoring, and Catchpoint is in that MQ on the IPM side. Are we at the point where this sector needs a full Magic Quadrant?
Yes, we are, and yes, Gartner did. I would stress that is in fact their first ever Magic Quadrant on digital experience monitoring, talking about capabilities like internet performance monitoring, real user correlation, and I absolutely do think it does speak to the evolution we've been jamming on for the last few minutes, as we were mentioning earlier. The whole internet is your new network mantra, and the fact that an outside-in approach should be a priority. I absolutely do think we need this.
All right. Well, that does bring us to the end of our time. If we've piqued folks' interest in Catchpoint, where can they go to find out more?
Please visit us at catchpoint.com/techbytes. And again, thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one more time, catchpoint.com/techbytes. And Leo, thanks for joining us. And we thank Catchpoint for being a sponsor. If you like this episode, there are many more fine, free technical podcasts and our community blog. It's all at packetpushers.net. You can follow Ethan and I on LinkedIn. You can hear all these podcasts on Spotify. And if you would, leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts, but it helps. And last but not least, remember that too much networking would never be enough.